Historically, there have been a number of ways in which people have viewed the world around them and their place in it. An example of one such worldview passed down to us from ancient times is that there's a God that's invisible and immortal that created this material world, this lake and the earth and man in it. And as a result of man's rebellion, he became mortal, although God may have provided a way back to immortality and back to God. Very different from a religious worldview is the scientific worldview. This view of reality focuses on that which can be seen, that which can be measured, that which can be understood. An example of early science was the work of Isaac Newton, who mathematically defined forces of nature so that not only could he calculate the speed of an apple falling from a tree, but he could calculate the velocity of the moon circling the earth. It was inevitable that eventually science would turn life itself into a matter of scientific study, to put life under the microscope, and ultimately to put aging and death under the microscope as well. And an example of one such scientist was Charles Asbury Stevens, who lived here in Norway Lake, Maine, beside this lake, behind Lake Penissiwasi. Stevens was the first American to feel passionately about the problem of aging and death. And as a result, he put all of his personal resources into building a sprawling building called the laboratory, in which he hoped he would unite scientists from around the world to join with him in a scientific study of aging and ultimately conquering death itself. How is it possible that a scientist as intelligent as C.A. Stevens, living in the early 1900s, to have come to the conclusion that it's possible to have salvation by science? To understand this, I think it's useful to go back into the preceding century, that is back into the 1800s, and observe three revolutions of thought that were to forever change the world of biology. The first revolution was known as the cell theory of life. And according to this new understanding, humans are not so much single living entities as we are a swarm of trillions of living entities called cells that are glued together to make the fabric of the tissues of the human body. The second revolution of thought, a thought bomb really, was Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, first published in the mid-1800s. This new understanding of the origins of life on Earth shook the foundations of the church, but it also provided biologists with an entirely new perspective on life. The third revolution was really a synthesis of the previous two, the cell theory on the one hand, the theory of evolution on the other. And then in the hands of a brilliant German naturalist named August Weissman, these two preceding theories were merged together to make a new hypothesis. Weissman proposed a hypothesis for the evolutionary origins of aging and death. His theory was not based in religion, it was based in observable science. It was based in cell biology. All of this became possible because in the early 1800s, scientists had for the first time powerful new microscopes that allowed them to peer into the fine structure of life itself. So let's look first at the origin of the cell theory of life. All of the arrows really point back to this man, Johannes Peter Muller, born in 1801. He was a German biologist known for his obsessive interest in finding meaning in nature. He collected and studied many hundreds of diverse forms of life on Earth and sought for unifying themes behind that diversity. He was said to have had a genius for synthesizing diverse observations, leading to novel and deep insights into biology. Part of this may have been his initial interest in theology, which he carried over later in life as a continued search for God's design in nature. Muller was said to have a warm personal nature and was an unusually devoted mentor to his students. Perhaps this explains the enormous number of accomplished scientists emerging from his laboratory. Two such students were Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann, considered to be the founders of the cell theory of life. In this treatise, published in 1847, Schleiden provided evidence of cells in diverse types of plants, and in the various tissues such as the roots, stems, and leaves. So what we see as a tree with distinct structures was in reality a vast multicellular organism, with some cells specialized to collect sunlight and generate energy for the rest of the tree, some, like those in the roots, performing the role of absorbing water and nutrition from the soil. Similarly, Schwann convincingly demonstrated that the various tissues of animals, such as the cartilage of a joint, or teeth, blood vessels, and muscle, were a compilation of cells, not unlike those in the plant. With time, these observations were confirmed in other laboratories, and stains were identified that could highlight various components in the cell. So, despite the profound differences in the outward appearance of a plant and animal, each was composed of cells of similar appearance. In complex animals such as man, the diversity of forms and complex arrangement of cells in various tissues was breathtaking. This was really an entirely new way of seeing life. You and I and our loved ones turned out to be a menagerie of trillions of beautiful cells, assembled in a complex manner to comprise the various tissues of the body, each tissue performing some essential function for the organism in question. And so we saw the gradual acceptance of the cell theory of life. This theory, simply put, stated that all living organisms are composed of one or more living cells, and that the cell, not the total organism, was the most basic unit of life. Another one of Muller's students was named Rudolf Virchow, and he extended these advances to a microscopic study of disease. He was able to show that in many cases, diseases were associated with reproducible abnormalities in the cellular structure of a particular tissue. His efforts to bring microscopic analysis to the study of disease led to him being honored with the title of the father of modern pathology. At about the same time, Louis Pasteur was extending the work of the Muller group, mostly in the study of the growth of bacteria and yeast in the laboratory. He also was attempting to prove that cellular life, in this case bacterial life, could not spontaneously generate in the presence of decaying food. Instead, he proposed omni vivum ex vivo, which is Latin for the phrase, all life comes from pre-existing life. In other words, living bacteria had to be present in the food in the beginning in order for bacteria to multiply and spoil the food. New life forms by reproduction from pre-existing life, not from spontaneous generation from the non-living. These theories had profound implications. For example, refuting the ancient belief that the seed buried in the ground was decomposed and then spontaneously brought back to life undermined the evidence for resurrection proposed by Jesus and the Apostle Paul in the Bible. The cell theory suggested that germination of the seed in springtime was instead the result of cells in the seed that never actually died. The germination of the seed was not a supernatural event. It was not a resurrection. The living cells in the seed were instead replicating, using the seed as food for that growth, and were the source of the new life in springtime. Instead of a miracle of continual creation of life, it was a continuous cycle of existing life. It was simply part of the natural life cycle of the plant. Since Virchow was focused on animal biology, he vocalized the conclusion of the Muller lab, which was summarized in an analogous phrase, omnis cellula et cellula, Latin for all cells come from pre-existing cells. So, in the same way, for cells to exist, there must have been pre-existing cells that they came from. Of course, if literally true, this concept had profound implications for our view of human life. If cells can only come from pre-existing cells that divide such that one cell becomes two become four, and then four become eight, and so on, then it must necessarily mean that we as humans, being a vast collection of these cells, must have originated from a single cell, and that cell must have come in some manner from our parents, and their cells from their parents, and so on. Schwann demonstrated that the egg was itself a cell, but where was the egg cell in the human? It remained for this man, Carl Ernst von Behr, to discover for the first time the egg cell in mammals, from which all the cells in the body originate. Von Behr, primarily known for his pioneering work in embryology, had a broad range of interests, but the study of the embryological development of diverse species appears to have been a particular focus of his. In 1826, when studying the ovary of a dog, he saw for the first time this primordial egg cell in a mammal, which was eventually published in a work called On the Genesis of the Ovum in Mammals and Man. In his own words, "When I observed the ovary, I discovered a small yellow spot in a little sac. How strange, I thought. What could it be? I opened one of these little sacs, lifting it carefully with a knife onto a watch glass filled with water, and put it under the microscope. I shrank back, as if struck by lightning, for I clearly saw a minuscule and well-developed yellow sphere of yolk." Later in the century, the fertilization of egg cells by sperm was recognized. It became clear then that the union of a single sperm and egg cell to create one united cell was the basis of sexual reproduction. And so now, for the first time in the history of the world, human beings understood how the supposed miracle of the appearance of new germinating life was accomplished. It was all about cells. We suddenly had a coherent picture of the cellular history of plant and animal life. While some complained about science crowding out the role of the supernatural in the process of reproduction, von Behr found the observations mesmerizing. Each individual animal begins with a single fertilized egg cell. Then, through an amazing process of cell division, those initial cells morph into the diverse tissues of a body, while in every stage being a living, functional organism. How amazing this process must be. Von Behr's eye was keen enough to notice the similarity of many animals in the early stages of their embryonic development. Here, written in his own hand in 1826, some 33 years before Darwin's publication of the theory of evolution, he is synthesizing his many observations into a tree of relatedness of diverse organisms. Simplest were the single-celled animals, which compared in multicellular animals to the egg cell. Then there were the simple aquatic invertebrate species, which during their development resembled in many respects the early stages of the development of higher mammals. And von Behr extended this tree on to the diverse vertebrate species. Let's stop for a moment and ask ourselves, what was this emerging picture of life telling us? If we were to think like Johannes Muller, what was the tree telling us about life and its origins? If life is a continual cascade of cell division, we can imagine not only how species continue to reproduce, but we can also imagine how this process must have occurred in the past, indeed since the dawn of life on Earth. It appears that von Behr extended his research into other realms of science, such as paleontology, animal breeding, and biogeography, and began to explore startling new lines of thought. In 1834, von Behr stated, "We may also conclude that the complete extinction of very many types is certain, and that the emergence, not simultaneous but gradual, of many types is equally certain." Von Behr was beginning to see a picture emerge, as when a puzzle is slowly assembled. The emergence of new types of life. Startling new thoughts indeed. Let's take these one at a time, beginning with paleontology, the story of life as recorded in the layers of the sediments of the earth. An important milestone in the science of the study of the history of the earth, or the field known as geology, and the scientific study of the history of life on earth, called paleontology, came with the birth of Charles Lyle in 1797. Lyle was a student of stratigraphy, and seen here behind me are the layers or the pages of the book of the history of life on earth. Lyle understood that these sediments could be laid down in, say, after a rainstorm or volcanic ash deposits. But what surprised him was when one studied the forms of life in the lowest levels of the strata on Earth. Life was very strange. Very few animals that we know of today, like humans, vertebrate animals like horses and cats and dogs, were present in the lower strata of the earth. Instead, there were strange forms of life, mostly invertebrate animals like starfish or sea urchins. But then as you moved up further in the rock strata all around the earth, life became progressively more familiar. In the middle strata of life, we began to see reptiles, the age of the dinosaurs. But it was only in the very surface layers of the rocks on Earth that humans appeared. Lyle offered more precision in cataloging the chapters of the history of life on Earth, the most ancient fossil layers being called the Paleozoic, from the Greek words paleos, meaning old, and zoe, meaning life. Then layered on top of these were the more recent forms of life called the Mesozoic, meso being Greek again for middle, and zoe for life, or middle life. This was the time of the dinosaurs. And then on the top was that of the Cenozoic, again from the Greek kainos, meaning new, and zoe, life. Today we have a much more comprehensive catalog of the fossil history of life on Earth, including thousands of species. Now, this is not a religiously or philosophically biased perspective of that history. It's simply a numerical compilation of the fossils that appear in the rocks. In this compilation of many thousands of animal and plant types, going back in time through millions of years to the time of the dinosaurs and beyond, the numbers and percentage of animals that are still extant today progressively declines. In other words, the world of plants and animals become more and more strange as we go back in time. As this data gradually became published and discussed, scientists with a Christian worldview became increasingly concerned. How does the story of the history of life on Earth align with that described in the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis? Just when did all these animals die? And did the progression of life in the fossil record agree with the biblical account of creation? Early Christians assumed that the sediments containing the remains of life were the result of Noah's flood. These concepts were introduced in more modern times by the Seventh-day Adventist writer George McCready Price in his book, The New Geology. In this work, he provided supposed documentation supporting the flood model. But Price was self-taught and never obtained any formal training in geology, sedimentology, or paleontology. Instead, his book was intended to support his own religious presuppositions. If the flood model were true, why couldn't any remnants of human occupation occur in the lower rocks? Similarly, the flowering plants suddenly appear in the Cenozoic. Why aren't they found in the Paleozoic? Their pollen spreads over thousands of miles in the wind. Why can't fossil pollen be found in the ancient rocks? The simple answer was that the progression of life in the fossil record was showing us that there was a series of very different worlds in the past. Flowering plants didn't exist in the Paleozoic era, and humans didn't exist in the Paleozoic or the Mesozoic eras. This led early thinkers to ask, just how long ago did these ancient and now extinct plants and animals dominate life on Earth? I grew up in the state of Michigan. Early in my life, I recognized that answers to the questions relating to the history of life on Earth were the foundation stones on which to build a solid and enduring worldview. My own search for meaning in nature led me to a study of nearby geology. Some of my favorite memories are collecting fossils from the shoreline of Lake Michigan. Here, for instance, is a stone common in Michigan called a Petoskey stone. It is the fossilized remains of an ancient coral species called Hexagonaria. Even as a young scientist with little training, it was relatively easy to determine with certainty that life on the Earth was extremely old by human standards. So let's take a moment to look at what these fossils can actually tell us. Coral is a sort of a skeletal remain of small animals called polyps that look like miniature sea anemones. The coral itself is made of calcium carbonate, or lime. Typically, one generation of coral polyps is built upon the skeletal remains of previous generations, and so coral reefs build up over time. The reef itself, therefore, like the layers of sediments around the world, can be read as a book recording the history of life in certain oceans around the world. We learned a tremendous amount about the fossil history of coral reefs in the late 1940s, when the U.S. Geological Survey drilled deep cores into the Inuiatak and the Bikini Atolls prior to setting off a series of tests of atomic weapons. At Inuiatak, the cores showed a total of some 4,610 feet of accumulated coral. Since coral exists today, it's easy to see how fast it can accumulate. Of course, it can grow faster or slower depending on the temperature of the water and the availability of nutrients. But being generous, let's assume that an average reef accumulates coral at about 8 millimeters per year. Then, doing the math, we have 4,610 feet divided by 8 millimeters, or 176,000 years. Well, that's significantly longer than the 6,000 years advocated by Archbishop Usher as the age of the Earth. But such reefs can be found all around the world, even in the fossil record of the continental United States. Similar cores have been dug in every state by petroleum geologists looking for sources of crude oil. In the state of Texas, there is the Great Capitan Reef. And in my home state of Michigan, for instance, the entire state is the remains of an ancient depression in the surface of the earth called the Michigan Basin, once filled with seawater and surrounded by coral reefs. In the north of Michigan, near Grand Traverse Bay, such reefs are exposed at the Earth's surface. The Traverse Member is an example of such an ancient reef estimated to be over 350 million years old. At one point, it is 800 feet in thickness, and at the rate of growth of 8 millimeters a year, it would take at least 30,000 years to build assuming, of course, there were no interruptions in its growth. Interestingly, beneath it, older sediments exist, which are the deposits of evaporated seawater, resulting in massive deposits of salt. Geologists call these sediments evaporites. It appears that the Michigan Basin was once surrounded by reefs that periodically opened to flooding by seawater, evaporated, and then opened again. As a result, Michigan contains an estimated 30,000 trillion tons of salt underground. If such salt deposits resulted from a single worldwide flood, it would require 4 miles of seawater and a minimum of 3,000 years to evaporate. Of course, these observations are merely a glimpse of what is a growing knowledge of the complex ecosystems represented in the fossil record. With time, it became clear that each layer represented fossil assemblages of either marine or terrestrial deposits with animals that naturally lived together in that time and space. In other words, they were not a chaotic mix, as anticipated if the animals were buried by rampaging floodwaters. Animals were found in habitats, such as this ancient shrimp species in the same layer of rock with a now extinct species of fern, and delicate fern fronds such as this annularia in Paleozoic rocks appears to have fallen in still waters, not the tumultuous floodwaters of the Noahic story. And there is abundant evidence of life in its normal paleo environment in the fossil record. Many layers of trees may be found with their root systems intact, upright, with the very leaves that they shed at the level of the ancient soils. Some layers show what we call trace fossils, such as ancient ripple marks, evidence of gentle wave action near a shoreline, mud cracks formed by mud drying in the sunlight, even the footprints of animals such as trilobites that foraged for food on the ocean floor and then burrowed into the mud to rest. In later ages, we see traces of the giant dinosaurs in fossil footprints, clusters of dinosaur eggs, and of course the skeletons of the dinosaurs themselves. How are we to harmonize all this history of life? Creationists may attempt to explain this as ecological zonation. In other words, humans and other vertebrate animals were able to run away from the floodwaters, escaping to the mountains before they were drowned, and therefore they're buried at the highest level in the sediments. But the progression of life we see in the fossil record extends to all species, including the plants, and it is difficult to imagine the plants running uphill. So scientists like Lyle, who considered themselves Christians, had to ask, what are we to make of the story being told to us by the fossil record? And more importantly, the history of death as told in the fossil record, compared with the biblical account and with biblical theology of the fall of man and its account of the origin of death. Late in the 18th century, mankind had learned to stand on the firm ground of reason and to use his brain as a guide to all aspects of life. And so it was inevitable that mankind would turn that light of reason onto this question of how we came to be on this planet and how did it come to be that we age and die. Two scientists that played a fundamental role in this new knowledge were Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, scientists that had the privilege in the 1800s of traveling around the world and discovering life in all of its complexity across the planet. And they were to describe at least two fundamental new insights that was to lay a thought bomb that fundamentally transformed how we think about life and aging and death. Charles Darwin stepped aboard a ship known as the Beagle on December 27, 1831, carrying with him Lyell's Principles of Geology. As the ship's naturalist, the long hours at sea with Lyell's geology in one hand, and his observations about animal and plant life around the world in his other hand, led him to believe that perhaps the explanation for the origin of life on Earth was that all forms of life were related to each other, what today we call the theory of evolution. But how could such speciation occur? Darwin concluded that because some animals in captivity, like dogs, could dramatically be altered through selective breeding, presumably ancient hunters formed friendships with wolves, and those that made the best companions were kept and bred to make friendlier and even more beneficial hunting companions. But imagine that for some reason, nature itself did this selection. Let's imagine that we enter another ice age, for instance. Animals with white coats would be better camouflaged against the backdrop of snow, so would survive better compared to the darker colors, which would be more easily seen and attacked by predators. The animals with white coats would then continue to breed, and we would see a shift in the population toward dogs, all of which were light-colored. This would not be the selection at the hand of man. Instead, it would be a form of selection through the forces of nature. Darwin called this natural selection. In essence, he suggested that all of life, not just that of dogs, originated in this manner. And the fossil record, and Lyell's progression of life, and the tree that von Behr had started to construct, reflected the natural history of that slow evolution by natural selection. I mentioned that there was another scientist at about the same time pursuing these ideas. Alfred Russel Wallace was also exploring life around the world. He found evidence for the theory of evolution in what is called biogeography, which is the scientific study of the geographical distribution of life across the planet. Here, for instance, is what is called Wallace's Line, a natural point of division between islands in Southeast Asia that were once connected during the Ice Age to the north, and islands to the south, including Australia. Wallace observed that to the north of the line, mammals were present in the various forms we know in North America today, namely placental mammals that gestate in the uterus and obtain nutrition from its mother through a placenta. In contrast, to the south of the line, Wallace found that mammals were all marsupial. They left their mother early in development and then continued their development in a pouch. To the north, one finds placental dogs. To the south, marsupial dogs. To the north of the line, we find placental cats. To the south, marsupial cats that bear their young in a pouch. And the same is true for flying squirrels, mice, anteaters, moles, and so on. How is one to explain this? Did Noah bring his ark to the islands south of Wallace's Line and selectively let out all the animals that gave birth to the babies in pouches? A much more reasonable explanation appeared to be that each region, being geographically isolated, evolved the diverse species from a common ancestor. There were other reasons to lean toward the evolutionary explanation. There were a growing list of fossils representing what appeared to be intermediate forms in the tree of the progression of life. One classical example is Archaeopteryx, a reptile bearing feathers, but clearly an animal not capable of flight. In the Australian region, we find remnants of very primitive mammals, such as this echidna, which actually gives birth to its young from eggs, unlike all the modern marsupial and placental mammals. And so here in Darwin's own hand, like von Behr, he sketched out an evolutionary tree of mammals, identifying points of mutual origin of the placental and the marsupial species. But unlike von Behr, he proposed a mechanistic force for evolution, namely natural selection. Darwin's theory of evolution was presented on July 1st, 1858, before the Linnaean Society in London, along with a similar presentation by Alfred Russel Wallace, at the invitation of Charles Lyle. And less than a year later, Darwin published his magnum opus, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. It was destined to be one of the most influential books ever published. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, An even bigger thought bomb was in the works as a result of uniting the cell theory with the theory of evolution. One important detail remaining to be explained was how the form of a plant or an animal could be inherited from generation to generation. Darwin proposed that the cells in their body somehow transmitted the information about the form of the body in tiny, still unobserved particles called gemmules, which collected in the sperm or egg cell that formed a new plant or animal. A German naturalist named August Weissman had a much simpler explanation of heredity. He suggested that there was a lineage of cells that was simply carrying the hereditary information from one generation to the next. Weissman called these cells that connected the generations the germline, cells that are capable of germinating new life. Weissman proved to be right. But in explaining heredity, he also lit the fuse on a much more explosive conclusion. In his book, Essays on Heredity, he wrote a prescient theory for the evolutionary origin of aging and death. He begins with a tribute to Muller. I can scarcely do better than begin with the simple but significant words of Johannes Muller. Organic bodies are perishable, while life maintains the appearance of immortality in the constant succession of similar individuals. The individuals themselves pass away. Weissman proposed that life began in the ancient oceans as single-celled organisms that could replicate themselves. So one cell became two cells in the process we call cell division. And that they could do this without inherent aging. They could die because the cells could lack food, but there was no aging process. And so he used the word immortal to describe these cells. Then he proposed something very significant happened. These cells in the process of cell division aggregated themselves together sort of like clusters of grapes to make a multicellular animal. And some of these cells specialized themselves to become the cells of what he called the soma, or the body. These somatic cells, Weissman proposed, were destined to age and die for the first time. But some of the cells that he called the germline had the luxury of replicating themselves without limit, and so they retained this immortality of ancient primordial life. And so for the first time in the history of evolution, we have the division between the immortal germline cells that can perpetuate the species, carrying genetic information from generation to generation, and somatic cells that are destined to age and die, and hence the evolutionary origin of aging and death. So, as he was to write, death, he proposed, takes place because a worn-out tissue cannot forever renew itself, and because a capacity for increase by means of cell division is not everlasting, but finite. So the origin of death was now attributed to cell biology, to a difference in the behaviors of cells branching off from the immortal germline to make somatic cells. This explanation did not depend upon a biblical understanding of a historic rebellion of man against God. What a shift in thinking. So Weissman drew a line now called the Weissman barrier. To the left of this line, cells can potentially perpetuate heredity and the species, and so these cells, and sometimes whole organisms, are immortal. The cells can replicate without limit and can regenerate tissues without limit. An example of such animals would be the multicellular organism known as Hydra. It shows no evidence of aging. If it is broken into pieces, the cells in each piece can regenerate a new organism, and they can do this forever. So Weissman was proposing a scientific, biological interpretation of the origin of death for the soma, or the body. He was saying that the mortality of the soma, outside of the Weissman barrier, was selected for in the course of evolution as a reproduction strategy. Nature cared nothing for the individual life. Life evolved selecting for a strategy that perpetuates the species, not the individual. The immortal germline was the important thing. The somatic cells were disposable, a transport mechanism, or more rudely put, a reproductive appendage that the germline cells use to accomplish their aims, which is replicating endlessly. So simply put, sperm and egg cells use us to perpetuate themselves. We, the somatic cells, are the dandelion fluff that carries the germ cells, the sperm and the egg, through space and time. At the risk of sounding repetitious, let me say this another way. Sometimes this is put forward as the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? In the first half of the 1800s, scientists would have said that an egg is a chicken's way of making another chicken. Weissman turned this upside down. He was saying that the chicken, that is to say the soma, was an egg's way of making another egg. So through the eyes of the thoughtful cell biologist today, all of the life around us, the trees and their green leaves, the flowers blooming in springtime, the animal kingdom in all of its splendor, are in reality transport vehicles, reproduction machines used by germline cells to carry on throughout the millennia. So let's summarize. In the ancient world, there was a common belief that the basis for the immortal renewal of life was the force of mystery deities. The gods were immortal, but we were mortal. These gods were known under various names, Osiris and Isis, or Demeter and Dionysus, and so on. But the common theme was the hope that through initiation into the religion, one could obtain the gift of immortal renewal, promising a resurrection back to immortality. The gift was in the form of a pharmakon athanasius, or a drug of immortality, usually dispensed in the form of a secret communion ceremony. But this conception that the seed died in the ground and was resurrected by the gift of the gods was just wrong. With the advent of the cell theory and the theory of evolution, Darwin proposed that heredity, and hence immortal renewal, was propagated by unseen gemmules that came from all the cells in the body and were transported into the sperm and egg cells, allowing babies to be born indefinitely, perpetuating the species. Darwin may have been right about his theory of evolution, but his theory about heredity and how it was passed from generation to generation was wrong. Lastly, August Weissman proposed that there was an immortal lineage of cells that simply carried hereditary information from one generation to the next. This lineage of cells he called the germline. He proposed that these immortal cells were the basis of the immortal renewal of life. From this point on, I will color these cells green as a reminder that they are the face of Neter, or Osiris, the true basis of immortal regeneration. But in the course of evolution, the somatic cells passed beyond the Weissman barrier. They passed into mortality. The problem with this, of course, is that we and those we love are the somatic cells, and we are biologically programmed to age and die. As a young person, very early one foggy summer morning, I returned from the shores of Lake Michigan and pulled into this cemetery near my hometown. It was at about the time that I began to weigh in the balance the validity of the Christian worldview. Here, near this statue of Jesus, I saw a monarch butterfly fluttering on the ground, apparently in distress. The butterfly has long been a symbol of the soul leaving the body at death. In total sincerity, I laid it in the hands of the statue and asked that Jesus would have mercy and heal this dying creature. While I prayed, instead of being renewed and taking to flight, the butterfly slowly closed its wings and died. What happens when we leave our loved ones in the hands of religion? Will the souls of our loved ones die the same way? As I walked away, I noticed on the flagstones leading to the statue a fossil, likely over 300 million years of age. Death, I realized, has been a feature of life going back many millions of years. How then did it make sense to say that as in Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made to live? Sir William Osler, often called the father of modern medicine, said it well in a lecture he gave in 1904 called Science and Immortality. You who listen to me today feel organized units in a generation with clear-cut features of its own, a chosen section of the finely woven fringe of life built on the coral reef of past generations. And perhaps, if any, you citizens of no mean city have the right to feel of some importance. The revelations of modern embryology are a terrible blow to this pride of descent. The individual is nothing more than a transient offshoot of a germplasm, which has an unbroken continuity from generation to generation, from age to age. This astounding revelation not only necessitates a readjustment of our ideas on heredity, but it also gives to human life a new and not very pleasant meaning. Science minimizes to the vanishing point the importance of the individual man and claims that the whole cosmic and biological laws which control his destiny are wholly inconsistent with the special providence view in which we are all educated, that beneficent fatherly providence which cares for the sparrow and numbers the very hairs on our head. In the modern era, this has led us to ask the question, is there a way out of this labyrinth? After all, we're mated from a lineage of cells that have been proliferating since the dawn of life on this planet. And the cells that make up our human body, the somatic cells, will die for the first time in billions of years with the death of you and me. And so the question is there a way of transforming the immortality of the germline into the soma? Is immortality transfer possible? This is mankind's greatest goal, and it has always been so. At the beginning of this video, I touched upon the life of C.A. Stevens, the enormous value he played on the individual human life, and his passion to look to science for a path to immortal life. While obtaining a medical degree, Stevens earned a living as a writer, primarily for the Youth's Companion, a Boston-based newspaper. In a series of stories later collected in a volume called When Life Was Young, he recounted some of his experiences growing up in the mid-1800s in Maine. One event that was to profoundly shape his own life apparently occurred here in a family cemetery at the funeral of a relative. During the days following the 4th, this impression of death, which had entered my mind, began to assume more definite limits and grew pertinent to my own status. I had heard that the average age of man was 33 years, and granting that I should reach that age, I could expect to live a little over 20 years more. That was a long time, to be sure, 20 years, but it would pass, and at the end of it, I should have to die and look as that man looked and be buried in the ground. The thought of it caused me to gasp suddenly, and filled me with a sense of terror and despair so awful that I could scarcely restrain myself from crying out. Most young people, I conjecture, pass through a similar mental experience when the drear fact of death is first realized. That passion for life was realized later in C.A. Stevens' life with a vision for a union of scientists around the world to attack the problem of human aging and death using the tools of the scientific method. With the dawn of World War I and the loss of certain benefactors, he realized that his vision would not occur in his own lifetime. Toward the end of his life, C.A. Stevens wrote an essay called At the Darkest Hour. And the essay begins with these words: "From many points of view, the opening of the 20th century is humanity's brightest hour. The brightest, the most hopeful since life first came forth on the earth. Scientific discoveries are multiplying and open vistas of promise, which even while they startle, encourage us to hope great things. And other grander discoveries are beyond doubt at the threshold. There is the thrill of expectancy in the air of these opening years of the new century, a conviction that all which has preceded will soon be surpassed. Grand, hopeful, and benign as is this progress, so prophetic of a mighty future for humanity, it is nonetheless tinged with an ever-deepening sadness for each and all of us personally. A magnificent future is dawning, but we shall not see it. A few months, a few years more at most, and personally we must close our eyes in death and drop back into the insentient void. In truth, it is this very awakening of the intellect, this latter-day vision of the future, which renders death so grievous, so inopportune, so seemingly unbelievable." At the end of his essay, he said, "We can but feel, therefore, that we live at humanity's darkest hour, the hour before the dawn. We live too late to be buoyed and comforted by the illusions of religion, too soon to reach the goal and snatch our lives from the grasp of death. If stronger beings on other spheres of space are watching us from afar at this dark hour of our planet's evolution, may they infuse patience and courage into our hearts. We have need of them."